Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Engineering Politics Podcast. Today is the first part of a long conversation I had with Truman from Return to Reason. We continue our conversation on the shifting hierarchy at large in America, and therefore around the world today. Because this conversation was so long, almost 3 hours to be exact, we decided to split it up into 3 different podcasts. This will be the Engineering Politics Podcast number 17, 18, and 19. But if you want a good foundation for this discussion, since this is a topic we've expanded on in several podcasts already, listen to the Engineering Politics Podcast number 16 to get caught up. And because it's a long podcast, there will be no bonus content at the end. But I would still appreciate you joining and subscribing to the Engineering Politics Locals community. You can go to engineeringpolitics.locals.com and become a member for free, or get a subscriber pass for as little as $2 per month. And you can use promo code EPFREE for a 3-month free trial of the subscription pass. That's spelled EPFREE. I'll go over more of where you can find me and support this content after the show. And also make sure to show some support for Truman of Return to Reason. You can find Truman and join his locals community at returntoreason.locals.com. If you like the Engineering Politics Locals community, you'll love the Return to Reason Locals community too, so go check them out. Alright, let's get this started. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Good to see you. Kevin and I from Engineering Politics are going to be having another conversation, a little bit of a follow-up on the last conversation that we had in terms of introducing the idea of how hierarchies function, what happens when they get corrupted, and a bunch of other stuff that sounds super esoteric, and I'm not even going to continue my my sentence there because I don't really want to talk about that as much. We're going to touch on that, but at the beginning of this, before Kevin and I usually talk a little bit before we record something, and we both kind of are just feeling tired, feeling a little bit out of it for different reasons. And one thing I thought would be good is because I asked him, I said, okay, you're tired, I'm tired. How many total people are going to watch this? We could have just, you could have emailed me and said, hey, Truman, I'm tired. Let's talk another time. And I could have emailed you and said, hey man, I'm kind of out of it. We could do this another time, but we didn't. And so I thought it'd be useful to kind of get into, okay, despite fatigue, despite, at least in my case, is discouragement quite often. Why is this important? Because I think that we outlined why the topic is important for the average person in terms from like a kind of a sanitized relevance kind of standpoint, but not so much why this is something that's important to us, why we do what we do here, and why this is important, on a personal level. So I had told Kevin, I said, what if we got into a little bit of like, why do we do this? Whether it's generally or this topic specifically, why is this something that we feel compelled to do? And by this, it's content, it's the writing, it's all of it. And so just kind of as a way of reminding ourselves and letting the viewers or listeners, whoever is, kind enough, and interested enough to, in the same things we are, to listen and engage with our content, to kind of remind them of like why we do what we do and why this is important to us personally. And then we can kind of get into some of those practical examples of corrupted hierarchies. And Kevin was totally on board with that. So I'll let you start while I pour myself some whiskey. Kevin just walked me through the brand that he got. Because last time, if you didn't watch it last time, he had a beer and I said he should switch to whiskey because it's healthier for you than beer.
For health reasons,
factually
kids.
true.
It is for health reasons.
It's
Whiskey's actually good for you.
Yeah, it
Don't
has.
believe the white coats.
Some whiskey has more like free radicals and antioxidants than red wine does. Is kind of interesting. But anyway, so I'm going to pour some of mine, which I probably won't buy again. This is not going to be as expensive or nice as Kevin's, but this is some Canadian honey cinnamon whiskey called 8 Seconds. I assume it's a bull riding reference. I don't really care about that. So
yeah, that's like the goal when you're riding a bull,
I suppose. Actually, my grandpa used to do bull riding. He was like on like TV and some minor bull riding circuits, and he would always tell me, this is my stepmom's dad, but he said that bull riding was the only sport where in the statistics they put the number of broken bones for each bull rider in it because of how common it is. I don't know if that's true or not, but it did up my respect for that as an activity.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Kevin,
And I believe there's a difference between bull riding and bar bull riding. I don't know if you guys have that a lot where you're at. They're all over Wisconsin. And normally it's like the goal is, 8 seconds or whatever, unless you notice this, especially with women, every 10 pounds to another 2 seconds, you ought to stay on. Because that bull, it's electronic, it's mechanical, but it gets tired.
That's
and
really
it's
funny.
fascinating to watch.
Sure
So to get into it, I'll hit up mine real fast. I have Whistle Pig here, so it's a rye whiskey. I'm not normally a rye whiskey guy, but I normally like the single malts, that caramely taste. But this was actually a recommendation by Joe Rogan. Me and him are good buddies, not really, but I listen to his podcast all the time. And this is one of his sponsors is Whistle Pig, and he normally does a 6-year. All I could find was a 10-year. Too bad for me. It's kind of an expensive whiskey, but it is amazing. Especially, again, I'm not a huge rye. I mean, I don't really hate any whiskey, really. Actually, cinnamon whiskey is probably the only one I dislike. But
I'll stick to honey from now on. I like honey whiskey, but
the honey whiskeys are good. I haven't tried the Jim Beam one yet, but I'll get
don't. Hey, it's not. Anyway.
All right. Well, they'll never sponsor the show.
It's true. All right, so Kevin, whiskey plugs out of the side. Let's talk about it, man. Let's talk about why this is important. Let me ask you this. I remember, so I did a New Year's my New Year's podcast, which was coincidentally around New Year's. One of the things I talked about in there was that I was really committed to not just contributing to the quantity of conversation, but the quality. Our quantity is going up massively, but it's very shallow. We have lots of people who are kind of in this space, podcasts, making content, writing stuff, so on and so forth. But we have a serious deficit in quality. And that was one thing that I remember I was committed to, of like, it's not that I think that the conversation needs more voices. Actually, I think it needs a lot less, but it does need more quality voices. And so that was a goal of mine. And I get the impression that in a similar vein, you have a kind of a goal in mind of, something that motivates you to kind of do this. You have your own website. You do this on Locals. You put, again, I will absolutely plug your content. That last EP zone that you did, although I'm kind of jealous of your video editing skills, man. Is really good. My point is that you work your butt off here, and so obviously you have a reason for doing that. You have a reason for contributing not just to the quantity but to the quality of the overall conversation. So what is that, man? What's your reasoning? Why do you do this?
Yeah. So I can give you some examples recently as to kind of the original reason why I did it. As my title suggests, I'm an engineer. I have no background in politics, political philosophy, poli-sci, even theology or law or any of these things that are normally applicable to like the Ben Shapiro's or former, did amazing in school, lawyers, at least have a lawyerly background. And stuff like that. I have none of that. So there is no realm where you would consider me the expert in a lot of the things they talk about. And normally that's a knock on a lot of people. And I think we're getting into this. You got to have a PhD in order to talk about anything dealing with mental health or physical health or anything like that.
Credentialing. There's a credentialing.
Right. Yes. That's the word I was searching. My mouth was going on autopilot as I was trying to figure out the word credentialing. And that's something I believe Eric Weinstein and Brett, they talk about that it's less important. And even in my hiring practices, I've kind of taken that into account. Like I don't need a master's degree engineer from Harvard in order to accomplish certain tasks. The thing I'm looking for is intellectual curiosity. Are you curious enough to research what you need to forward whatever objective you have? And if you can find someone like that, people who have that, I don't know really if it's an inherent talent or if it's just you're bred with it, or I don't know who gets that or how that is obtained. But if you can find someone with the intellectual curiosity to keep digging into something and research it themselves and not have being told to research it, you have a gem of an employee there. I mean, they're great at it. And so I've been listening to some podcasts, and the most recent one I listened to is Abigail Schreier on Joe Rogan, and she's an investigative journalist for Wall Street Journal. And she recently came out with a book. I think it's like an attack on our daughters or something like that. I don't think that's the name, but the general thesis is this transgender movement is disproportionately affecting young girls, especially in high school, because they're the most susceptible, especially during a when you're growing, you're becoming a woman. That's the easiest time to be persuaded into doing something. And all these girls who would normally end up being either slip into depression, anxiety, and all these other things you'll see young girls get into, they're getting pushed in the direction of become transgender.
Yep.
And, I don't want to explain that full story, but the point that they both hit on, her and Joe, that I think they kind of glossed over and they shouldn't have, is she is someone who's not a doctor, was never transgender, had nothing to do with this, didn't even have a real interest in it until I came across, someone asking her to investigate it. She was like throwing it around to other people to help them investigate it because everyone knew it was kind of radioactive. And she decided to take it upon herself. She's not an expert. She's not a doctor. She has no dog in the fight, but she took it on and she did an amazing job investigating this thing. And I can bring up other people like Matt Taibbi, who investigated and kind of tried to figure out what went wrong in 2008 with the housing crisis. And the dude's like, I didn't even know what a stock was at the time. And he did an amazing job. And it's because, one, he had that intellectual curiosity to keep investigating. And two, he had no dog in the fight. So, as explained to you before, I don't really believe there's such a thing as complete objectivity. You have a bias. There's something you're going into that you have, a bit of a dog in the fight. But if you can go from a place that you're completely uninterested into forcing yourself to investigate this thing, you'll be closer to finding the truth, especially faster to find the truth than a lot of other people. So, that was the way I looked at it for me. It's like, what would people think if they saw, a guy who has no real experience in this stuff give his own assessment to it? And I also wanted to add, more facts, more source material to make sure, people understood that I came from a spot, even though I have clear bias, I'm an open conservative and I'm going to come from that direction. What does a person who's not in this political space or this commentary space, like the Ben Shapiro's, Michael Knowles, Andrew Klavan's, all those guys, how do they see it? Because they got to be seeing it from another angle, right? So that's kind of what motivated me to jump into this type of space. And also it's just, I like to absorb material like this. So it was just an interesting experiment that, again, I started out creating a website so I could just host my own writing, because all I was doing was writing stuff down so I wouldn't forget about it in the future. Or, kind of when I read, I highlight books. I know there's a lot of readers who are like avidly against that. I think it's destroying the book. The only book that I don't highlight is the Bible. I go in there to highlight it so I can just look back at it at a later time and just hit the highlights. And if I can write something out myself, not only will that help me in the future by rereading it, it also makes me think through these ideas much more clearly. So I can put it in a nice, concise manner. And that's how I started out doing this. And that's really what drove me to begin doing this. That's why I got into the space, at least. So that's really my story.
How long ago, when did you first start? When was the first time, when did you create your website?
Let's say it was March of 2019. Yes. Yeah. So it was around like a year and a half ago. But again, that was more of I wanted to host my stuff. And if someone wanted to read it, so what? I didn't really have any sort of presence. I wasn't on YouTube. I was on Twitter, but I'm not good at Twitter. Twitter doesn't interest me. So it's not something I excel at. I wasn't really open about my beliefs too much on Facebook, just because I believe that's supposed to be a non-political space, although it's completely the opposite now. I try to keep my opinions out of it. So, I wasn't really openly doing this anywhere. I was just hosting it on there. If people found it, cool. If they didn't, whatever. And then I found an opportunity with locals to create my own community, and it's taken off from there.
Very cool. Yeah, I will say, for the people who say that you shouldn't highlight books, including the Bible, I vehemently disagree. I've got my Bible, as well as many other books, are highlighted up with notes and everything. So yeah, I mean, whatever helps you engage and re-engage and re-engage with the material, I think is useful. Okay, so what I heard you say is you had some thoughts, you were writing them down for yourself, and you were like, okay, why not? Why not? How much extra would it be for me to put this on a place where it's public so people can engage with it? And then that's how you started doing it, because you didn't want to do it on Facebook, which, yeah, Facebook has become so political. It's pure cancer, and I hate it. That's a whole nother thing. I don't want to get down the road of how much I hate Facebook, what it's become right now. It has nothing to do with Mark Zuckerberg, by the way. I don't have any issues with Mark Zuckerberg that I can think of.
Except for how he drinks water. How he drinks water is super weird.
Haven't seen it. I believe that it is.
Look it up.
I won't. But I believe you. Mostly because I'm like, man, I'm at the age where I've seen enough weird videos. Like I remember when the internet was the internet, when it was shock websites, hat memes. Exactly. It was those two things and chat rooms, those three things. And that was it. And so I've seen enough. I've seen enough things that anytime someone's like, you should check out this super weird, bizarre thing, I'm like, I've seen it. Maybe not that exact one, but I promise you I've seen it. Like I just am not. Anyway. So all that to say, so you were like, I might as well put this out here. If you had to, I realize I'm putting you on the spot because I didn't ask you this whenever we first started talking. If you had to put a fine point on the goal of your content, of what you're trying to do, whether it's like a mission or like some kind of thing that you tell yourself, you remind yourself of, this is why I do what I'm doing. What would that be? It doesn't have to be anything super polished, and maybe it is, but what is that?
Yeah. I mean, basically it started out with just, what do these ideas look like, through my lens, through my eyes? And really that's kind of like all of what opinion is. And, I guess it's not really an exciting answer, but, the way I see the world, I guess it can come from, a biblical point of view. I don't believe there is such a thing as good and evil people. There are only good and evil ideas, and you can choose to investigate ideas or you can choose to be consumed by them. And I see some examples of these people, I especially gravitate toward reading people whom I avidly disagree with. And I do that so I can understand what were the preconditions that led to this person being consumed by some of these evil ideas. And I kind of just want to learn the way they're thinking it, and then I'm going to digest it and really kind of restate it in my own words. And that's what a lot of my writing was. Now, a lot of it in the beginning was reading Thomas Sowell and, listening to people like Ben Shapiro and a lot of people I agree with. And basically, like I said, it was basically me just writing down the highlights and saying, how do I look at this and how can I make myself understand? So I think these guys are great at helping people understand, but sometimes you got to hear from someone outside of that bubble in order to really understand it in your own terms. And that's how I started out there, when I was just, again, me trying to learn what I've already read and repurposing it for myself. And then, I get into later where you get into people who don't agree with you and better understanding what led them there. Because again, like I said, no one's born evil. When we say there's no evil people, it's easy to say, well, Hitler. But I actually think that's an excellent point as to why we shouldn't look as people as evil. We should look as ideas as evil. Is because when we look at someone like Hitler and we call him just an evil person, we have now disassociated his actions. And that is why we can use the word Hitler as a descriptor to people who, like Donald Trump, calling him Hitler. You really think he wants to systematically eliminate 6 million Jews? No, because we've now disassociated the actions of Hitler with the name. And now we can use Hitler as just some pejorative that we can just off the cuff say someone's Hitler. And that's extremely damaging to our discourse and our understanding. And that's why I think you have to associate ideas and even actions with good and evil, not people.
All right. My theology compels me to give you some pushback against the people aren't born evil, but that's a conversation for another time. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I like that of just giving another lens. I mean, that's kind of some of the, whenever James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose and them talk about the way in which critical theory, for example, establishes truth, they use a thing they call standpoint epistemology, which is, truth is contingent or is developed from my standpoint. So what I perceive is what's true. My standpoint is what determines my perception of things. It's what determines that. But there, as much as I think that is completely ridiculous as a truth-seeking mechanism, it is very useful as a truth-disseminating mechanism, and that's kind of what you're describing there, which is that Thomas Sowell has been saying basically the same brilliant ideas for 50 years. Why haven't they caught on? In fact, why have they actually lost appeal or lost steam? You can find these videos of him doing these interviews and debates back in the 70s. I don't see a lot of Thomas Sowell debates from the 90s and from the 2000s. Why is that? Because people move past him. Now, that's an indictment of our culture more than it is of Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is a hero of mine, and I know he is of yours as well. But the point is that clearly there was something about the way those ideas were communicated that it made it to where it did not connect with enough people. Maybe it was the general marketing, maybe it was the reach, there's a lot of different explanations that are possible. But the point is for whatever the reason, there weren't enough people that were able to identify it. And so what I hear you saying, or identify with it. And so what I hear you saying is I wanted to kind of add a different perspective on some ideas that are true. So it's not like I brought some new truth to the conversation, but I said, here's another way of looking at it. Here's just another perspective on this that you might not get from some of the more mainstream people in this space, especially because I'm not an expert, but I'm just curious. I'm just intellectually curious. And I would argue, like what you were talking about with Abigail Schreier or with Matt Taibbi, that there are people who are, an autodidact, right? Someone who is self-educated, but becomes experts on a topic because they were interested and they were just trying to figure out what was true about the topic, not so much didn't have an agenda behind it. And so anyway, that's what I heard. Does that sound like did I understand you right? Is that
Perfectly?
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Man, it's interesting. Mine, the way that can I do it my turn? Can I do it my turn?
Yes. I was about to ask him, just to make sure this is an interview with me.
Yeah.
Question back at you.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to organically, so I'll just be, silly about it. But yeah, I remember, so I thought about doing, putting content out there, and I'd written some stuff, different blog, things for a while. But what really got me was Parkland. I was so frustrated at the conversation and stuff around Parkland. And I'd been really kind of building up to that moment. I voted for Clinton in the 2016 election. I voted for Bernie in the primary. And like most people, I was blindsided by Trump's win. However, because I think that there is a part of me that developed is very, very young age. I got super interested in apologetics and just different fact-based argument styles because, I realized that if I was going to, I was a pretty mouthy kid, but if I was going to make an argument, I wanted to make sure I was right. If I couldn't win in any other arena, I was going to win in the arena of facts. And so I was very zealous in terms, and that's how whenever I talk to people about my faith, I say that's how I eventually came to faith, was that I said this seems to actually be empirically true. And so I can't ignore it, even though I really kind of want to. That's what brought me to faith, was empirical facts surrounding the Christian faith. And obviously there are people who hear that and have lots of contentions, and then that's fine. But that's where I landed. And so regardless, after Trump's election in 2016, I was like, I clearly don't know, not just something, but a lot of somethings. what happened here? How did everyone get it so wrong? And I really was trying to understand, what did I miss? What did everyone miss? How did this happen? And I saw his election really as an outgrowth from some kind of cultural, social things that were going on. That's why I was even just talking to someone a couple days ago about Donald Trump, and they were talking about him and all these bad things about him. And I said, I'm not sure I necessarily disagree with some of those character assessments. They're talking about him being narcissistic and so stuff. I'm like, yeah, I think so, probably. But I'm not sure that it matters that much, because the things that created him predate him, and the issues that sustain him and created him will exist after he's gone. So we can talk about Donald Trump until we're blue in the face, and that's fine. If that's something you want to do, I guess we can do that. But it's going to do nothing, absolutely nothing, to address the precursors for his election. And that's where I think that the time and attention needs to be focused. But my point is that I had spent a couple of years trying to figure out, I'm like, there's a lot of things that I thought were true that obviously aren't true. And just trying to assess and look at perspectives that were different from my own in my own little bubble. I always tell people I had basically 3-4 sources of information. CNN was on the TV in my dorm room, and then at my apartment whenever I moved off campus in college, 24/7. That's all I had on was CNN, and NPR was preset 1 on my radio. And so and then plus like maybe the Daily Show or Weekend Update, not Weekend Update, Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. Those were kind of the main sources of information for me. And so I'm like, this clearly wasn't sufficient. And so I was already starting to open myself up to other ideas and just other perspectives. And then Parkland, I was so frustrated. And so I'm like, man, it seems really ridiculous. Remember CNN did that town hall where there were people yelling and calling, I think it was at the time, wasn't Marco Rubio, was it? It was calling him, saying he was just as bad. Yeah, Dana Loesch. Dana Loesch. Yep. Yeah. Saying that they were just as bad as the shooter himself. And I'm like, this is insane. This is absolutely crazy. There's no way this is an intelligent way to proceed. And I often equate it to, and since then, so in the Bible, Jeremiah was sent. I realize as this is coming out of my mouth how ridiculous it sounds. I'm only talking about the sentiment, not the role of Jeremiah as a prophet. Okay, only the sentiment he describes. He says that at one point, he says, if I tell, I'm not going to speak about it, I'm not going to talk about this anymore. It's like there's a fire shut up in my bones. I can't keep it in. And so, not talking about roles of prophet, I'm just saying that idea of feeling like you have something to contribute and have something to say, that it's actually more painful to not say it than to say it, is kind of the place I eventually found myself in, where I was just consumed with how come no one's talking about these things in a reasonable way? No one's being reasonable. And so that's where I get returned to reason from. Like, can we just be reasonable? Because I include things like civility and logic and respect and mutual respect and human dignity in reason, because we can't have a society without those things. We can't have a functioning society without those things. And so all of that absent. And so that's kind of where I've been since. So it's interesting that I stumbled into it where I was just frustrated, very frustrated with the conversation. There were sources that I used to trust, like CNN, again, for example, where I'm like, these guys are off the rails. These guys are completely off the rails. And I say that as someone who, I remember I had a Facebook, you could change your Facebook pictures. And I had one from, probably the mid, probably somewhere around 2008, 2009, somewhere like that, where it said Fox News, and it was FAUX News, fairly unbalanced. Like, I was highly critical of Fox News because they had that fair and balanced slogan, and also I was a hardcore Democrat at the time. But I was like, here are some people that I used to trust as unbiased, and as I thought they were trying to just give information and make things better, but they're not. They're just uncritically presenting things that are crazy and are really harmful. And that was my main thing. I get into in the very first video I did, I'm like, people were operating on a intellectual fast food diet. They want quick, expedient answers to very complicated questions. And if that's what your intellectual diet consists of, you're going to have a lot of health issues intellectually, just like if you just ate Big Macs, for every single meal, you're going to have some physical health issues. And if you just go off sound bites and little snippets, you're going to have intellectual health issues. And so I was just trying to add here's what I think is just objective. Like you said, there's that kind of, not an expert necessarily. I mean, my undergrad is in political science, but I don't, I wouldn't say I learned a whole lot from that degree, not from any deficiency from my professors. They were quite good. But that was before I got any type of medicine for ADHD. And so the study habits and the habits I developed in terms of passing classes of just like writing papers.
That's a common theme with people from poli-sci. It's a common theme. You don't really, it's kind of a sorry for you poli-sci majors.
No, you're fine.
Or just banking on that. But normally it's a jumping point to a master's degree somewhere else.
You can't do a lot. Yeah, usually it's law or journalism or economics, something like that.
It's a business degree kind of thing where it's like you go exactly there to go somewhere else. Yeah.
Well, and what's unfortunate is that if I would have actually, been able to or developed the skills or both to pay attention, I think that I would have learned lots. My professors were quite good. So I put all of that on myself, not on them. But the point is that like how you're talking about just being disinterested, not having a dog in the fight, but just saying, wait a second, why is this conversation so completely screwed up? And kind of seeing the implications of it remaining that way, right? Of this is really bad, the way people are looking at this stuff. And if it stays this way, it will only get worse. That was kind of that fire that I felt of just like, I have to at least try to, inject some kind of reason into this. And so that kind of brings us, that's a long kind of introduction, but brings us to why this is important. Again, like I said at the beginning, in our last video, which I would encourage people to go back and watch, it was over 2 hours, but it was a really good explanation of how hierarchies come to be. What is their function? How are they natural? In what ways can they become unnatural and self-serving and corrupted? And it was a really kind of interesting conversation. And we articulate specifically why this is important multiple times, right? We do, but it's from a very academic kind of standpoint, not why it's important to you, Kevin, why it's important to me, Truman. And so I thought that it would be useful to say, why do you make content? Why do I make content? Why are we even in this space? What are we trying to contribute? And that absolutely feeds into why we think this is important, because this has real world implications for us. So kind of on that note, if you were to say, man, here are my concerns here. So how old's I know you have a daughter, right?
Yeah, she's 7. My son is 8.
Okay, so you have a 7 and 8-year-old. So I've got a 14-month-old. So whenever you say, here are my concerns, and when I think about if the things that we talk about, whether it's here or in previous or in our own content, whatever, if they continue down the path they're on, I really am interested in the concept of trajectories of certain movements and certain ideas and so on and so forth. So if these things continue on their current trajectory, on their current course, play out, what does Ayn Rand say, to their logical conclusion? These things are brought to their logical conclusion. I see it as being X, either being fine or absolutely terrifying or a good thing, whatever. I would say we don't see it as a good thing. But regardless, there's something that we see that's going on right now that we want to kind of impede in some way because the trajectory is worrying to us. What do you see as that, if we're referencing to kind of be specific here, our cultural trends, our societal trends, whether it's the growing dominance of certain ideologies or trends of people self-censoring or so on and so forth, or just, outrage mobs. What do you see as the trajectory of those things, and how does that relate to your personal motivation for engaging with this kind of material? In what ways is it worrying, if at all? If not, why not? If so, why so? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So we've talked about that, there's this hierarchy that's emerging and it's trying to solidify itself. Right now it's really volatile because, again, we've talked about it before, that there are some sort of conflicting ideologies, and there's an issue with the Overton window, and you can't give that proper response. The people at the top of the hierarchy are going to keep moving leftward, and if you're not sufficiently moving leftward with them, you might get kicked out. So there's some volatility. There's some people who are woke people of today who are going to be the racists of tomorrow because they haven't maintained their wokeness. You talk about like J.K. Rowling, I believe it is, that's getting the boot now because she can no longer go leftward enough for the people who are in control of this ideology. So we've seen over the past, I would say, year. I mean, it's really accelerated that you hear of these ideas that are kind of in this space. It's far enough away from you. And, even though I'm a conservative, I think conservatives have inherently liberal tendencies. And that's probably more of a place where you come, where you might consider yourself a liberal, a classical liberal, that live, let live. Like, they're doing their thing as long as, they're doing it over there, that's fine. But over there has come over here. And, I'm fine with people believing what they want to believe. And, take an example of transgenderism. If you want to believe what you want to believe and you want to change your gender and be called she, even though you're obviously a he, I'll entertain you for a bit. The way I put it, especially this transgender thing, is like, if you have a doctorate in something that's not medical, I'm not going to call you a doctor unless you ask nicely. If you say, oh, excuse me, like, can you just address me as doctor? I worked really hard for that degree. I'd prefer to be called that instead of professor. I'll be like, okay, doctor. If you come back at me after say professor, I'm like, no, I'm a doctor. Guess what? I'm not calling you. I'm not calling you doctor. And I have the same rule with a outwardly transgender person. Like if you're going to come at me and say, no, I'm she, I'm like, well, guess what? You're not getting called she. Like it's a sign of respect. I feel like it's more of a sign of respect, bouncing back and forth, though I guess some people may not see it that way. Main point here is, though, when I'm getting an email from my daughter's school saying they're going to be teaching some of these things to young kids who don't even understand what sexuality really is. That's the point where it's like it's moved from over there to over here. And now it's entered my space. And now it's teaching my kids something that, I don't care what you think, is something that should be coming from me, not a teacher. This is not something that should be taught to them. Sexuality at all. I want you to stay out of it. That is what I'm teaching them. And it's one thing now, but it's pretty soon going to be other things. So like we talked about before, I've been reading a couple of books that I find awful, but I want to understand the background. One of them is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And I knew it was going to be bad. And this kind of contributes to why I'm so worn down, is not only have I been busy at work and I've been traveling a lot and, doing all these things and just, getting shut in with the new COVID policies sucks. What I've been doing in my free time is one of them is reading this book. And although I'm not predisposed to nihilism, I'm not someone who just says, what's the meaning anymore? Like, it's just not the way my brain operates. I do have empathy. And to me, this empathy works on a level when I read some of the things in there, and the beliefs that he seems like he sincerely holds. It wears down on me to think that, hey, this is someone who's been consumed by an evil idea. And not only is he consumed, he's teaching, because he's an intelligent guy. Like, I'm not insulting his intelligence or anything like that. It's just he's beginning to pass this stuff along to other people. And what he does here is something, I think we talked about, some James Lindsay's kind of talked about when we talk about critical theory, and something also that Thomas Sowell's talked about. There's a popular quote I love. This quote from Thomas Sowell is, you can make any claim true as long as you change the definition of just one word.
Yep.
And here you swap out the definition of racism to not be some discrimination based on race, but a discrimination that goes in a certain direction that is based on outcomes, not intention. That's pure evil. And if people aren't tuned enough to see that sleight of hand, because this is a magic trick, it's not serious science. It's a sleight of hand that he does. And if you aren't able to catch that sleight of hand, you're going to buy this hook, line, and sinker, because all the rest of it, as long as you believe in the certain preconditions that he sets forth by changing that one definition, the whole book makes sense. The whole book's compelling. And now when you're starting to teach this to academics, people who will be teaching other people, it's going to get into the schools, and it's going to start teaching my kids. And, as I've said to you before this, and I don't know if I've said it in another podcast, I'm not someone who gets mad easily, but if you want to make me mad, do something that harms a kid. Yep. And I don't know if it's because I have kids or I'm just like predisposed to those kind of feelings, but that will make me mad. And when you start teaching this stuff to young kids, that objectively is going to hurt their mental growth. It does nothing else than harm your growth as a human being. That's going to make me mad. And to kind of go back to some of my motivations I don't think were as noble as yours when I first started. Again, it was sincerely me just wanting to reread and re-understand things that I read from really, really smart people. I don't consider myself like a brilliant person at all, but what I do that puts me above, intellectually some other people is I read a lot of brilliant people, like a lot of people who are significantly smarter than me. And I can learn kind of what they've set forth, and I kind of expand on it on my own. And, that's how it started. But now seeing these really, really bad ideas and horrible ideologies manifest themselves in a way that's not only going to touch me, but touch my kids, that's a problem. That's my main motivation. It's be like, I can't be silent anymore. I can't sit here as, my kids, and not even my kids, other kids anywhere get corrupted with this awful, awful nonsense. That's what I feel like I need to stop, or at least need to add higher quality discourse to push back on it.
Totally.
That's really what it is.
No, that makes a lot of sense, man. I mean, that's a legitimate concern, right? You're talking about the development of not just your kids, but, tens of thousands of children across the country. And then if you include the West more generally, I mean, you're in the hundreds of thousands of range. With ideology that, again, is just corrosive. It's just corrosive and harmful to people. Whenever you were talking about how, it's okay if it's over there, but the minute you bring it over here, then now we have an issue. That's that whole, I'm okay with you. I mean, that was kind of Peterson's original objection to C16, right? He's like, you can say whatever you want to say about yourself, but the minute you start trying to force me to do that, then now we have an issue. I mean, that was Brett Weinstein at Evergreen. Like, yeah, day of absence, that's great, voluntary thing. Oh, the minute you're trying to force me to stay home just because of the color of my skin, well, now we've left the realm of good things, and now we're in the realm of actual racism, just by a different name. And so, those externalities are a big motivating factor for all of us. I mean, that's exactly what you said about whether it's, harming kids or just harming others. I realize this is something I've been, kind of kicking around. I don't know if you ever have this thought, but there is oftentimes I learned something about myself that I didn't previously know, or maybe I'm able to better articulate or better understand some aspect of myself that I, wouldn't have been able to previously articulate. But what you're talking about with kids is I've recently learned. So it was actually whenever I was watching, and we'll get into that here pretty shortly, but watching this documentary on the origins of the Jim Crow laws and of what it was like right after Reconstruction ended in 1878, but and they're showing these pictures of blacks that were lynched in the South, and I'm like, I can just feel like this hot anger coming over me, and it's the same anger I feel anytime, and the word that popped in my head was dignity. Anytime a human dignity is being subverted or sacrificed for whatever reason, and I realize that I'm actually just absolutely zealous about human dignity, and that what you're talking about is a subversion of human dignity whenever children are taught things that is harmful to them. whether it's things that are going to be harmful about how they view themselves or how they view others or both, it's something that's going to hurt their dignity and the dignity of others, because it perverts their lens of how they view reality and how they interact with other people. And that's a real problem. So let's transition, if we could, to getting into some of the specifics of what we talked about last time and some of these practical examples that are concerning to us. So to put a fine point on it, maybe you could use this for one of your clips here, and I'll try not to talk for 8.5 minutes. But this stuff matters. This stuff matters, not just in an academic sense. We're not just trying to talk to people about things that are interesting. This isn't some YouTube video, life hack, DIY something. This stuff matters, and it has real implications. The trajectory of our society, the trajectory of our culture, the trajectory of our habits and the way that we treat each other and speak to each other, that matters. And it's so naive to think that there's no threshold with which it can go from just being tense or just being frustrating to being dangerous, to being harmful, to being, a point of no return, as you might say. And so that's such a naive thing. And so the point is that I'm trying to get at, and what I feel like we were trying to kind of at least touch on, I don't know how well we did here in this first part, is that we don't just talk about this stuff because it tickles our fancies. I can talk about lots of things that I think are interesting or fun, and are way more exciting for me than things and trends that I see that are going to potentially end our country, end our freedoms. There's a lot of other things. But the reason why we're not talking about those things is because this matters in a real way. We're not trying to plug a book sale at the end of this. We're not trying to, get on some YAF speaking tour here. We're talking about this crap because it matters, because it has real world implications. And we understand what's at stake here in a way that I think a lot of people don't, good, bad, or neutral, in a way that a lot of people don't. And so that's why this idea, we talk about, like, let's talk about the hierarchies and how they shifted and all these other things. I'm like, dear God, like, who's going to listen to this? But you know what? It's important, because hierarchy is another way of saying the system that's going on right now that is supposed to be accomplishing certain things, but can become corrupted and impose its will on people. It is about power. That's as much as the postmodernists, when I talk about power, everything's about power. Hierarchies are about power. We talked about that in the last episode, that power really is only a problem as an extension of the way it's wielded. And there are people who are seizing power right now that want to wield it in a way that's really malevolent and really damaging. And so all that to say, this matters. And that's why we're talking about what we're talking about here. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know if I could put that in a more concise way. That wasn't actually concise at all. But do you have anything to add to that before we kind of transition to some examples of some of these corrupt hierarchies?
Yeah. So this is going to sound like it's not related, but it is, I swear.
I trust you.
There is a concern now that what happens if a Supreme Court justice, God forbid, passes away or retires before November? What should the Republicans do? Do they nominate? Do they try to push someone through? Or should they say, well, no, we're gonna be fair, and we're gonna say, no, we're gonna wait for after the election, so whoever wins can kind of nominate the next person? And people cite back in Merrick Garland, happened in 2016. The Republicans didn't let it happen. And so people are like, well, that set the precedent, right? And so precedent basically means what happened at this time that should kind of set the agenda and what we ought to do in future situations that are similar to it. And
stare decisis is what that's called in legal terms.
Yeah, exactly. but that's a big long word, and I'm not going to use it. So I'm going to use precedent.
Latin.
Right. Darn. But yeah. So to just close that loop, the Republicans are like, well, no, there are rules to the game, and if you have the Senate and you have the presidency, well, guess what? You get to do. Guess what? You weren't allowed to do in 2016 because you didn't have those things. So we're going to push someone through if that happens. So not to go into that, but the big thing here is precedent. What are we setting forth now that are going to be our rules of engagement in the future? What's happening now and what we're seeing with the emerging hierarchy is a precedent set. We are seeing every decision made based on how woke the conclusions will be. I kind of talked about it
or how much lip service it pays to that ideology, even if that's not actually.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
And no, this was an idea that I when it came across in How to Be an Anti-Racist. Kendi breaks down, and there are only two types of actions. He breaks it down in policy, but then he expands it to basically every single action you make. They're either racist or anti-racist. They either lead to a larger disparity amongst racial groups in some sort of category, or they lead to more equality or equity. Unless, of course, it's equity in the other direction, then it's fine. Talk about NFL, NBA. Obviously, it's unequal. There are not proportionate representation in those leagues, but we don't consider them racist. And we should not consider those racist. But the scary thing is, again, if we keep using this idea enough, it is going to become precedent. And when it becomes that way, we stop thinking about things critically, and we start thinking about them in a way that will reach this certain equity, we can call it, I guess. That's another sleight of hand they make. They used to call it equality. They realize that doesn't make sense, because as long as you're able to have the same or similar resources to come in, if you come out and you're different, that's still equality. But equality of outcome, in other words, equity. So an equitable outcome or equitable results, proportional results, so they kind of flipped out the equality for equity.
Yep.
And if we do that sleight of hand and we make that precedent, so what kind of equity are we getting from certain policies or lack of policies, which is something Kendi gets into quite often. It's like, if we see a disparity, it is either because of a policy that made the disparity or the lack of policy protecting. And he uses a specific word, protecting the people from this disparity. As if we ought to use policy instead of culture to come out in proportional results, which is like the exact opposite of the Andrew Breitbart quote, culture is downstream from politics, right? It reverses it. It's politics is downstream from culture. We ought to use politics to influence our culture, which we know for a fact. When you do that, you will almost always get the exact opposite results you want to, right? Yep. And it's replete with that war on, a lot of times, the war on crime, although war on crime works in some spaces. But, the war on poverty is one big one that resulted basically in the exact opposite of what we wanted to. The original thesis for the war on poverty was to get people not reliant on these welfare programs. That was literally what they put in there. And yep. What did it do? It resulted in the exact opposite.
Yep. And they changed the metric of success afterwards. I remember Soul writes about that.
Yeah. Well, again, that's in
how they changed the metric.
Well, that's in the vein of redefinition.
Yep.
If we refine the definition, we change, our stated goal, which we are seeing now. And that's what you're going to see in a hierarchy, because you shouldn't judge things by what they say they're going to do. You should judge things a lot of times by what they're doing, right? What they're actually trying to move
stated goals versus actual outcomes. That's the difference.
Right. Now, I don't want to conflate the two with kind of the racist, anti-racist idea. If it comes out with disproportionate equity, then it's a racist idea. Those are obviously two different things. And again, because you're flipping around definitions in that case. But my main point here, and something I want to just touch on before we move on, is the already lasting damaging effects we're beginning to see from this new emerging hierarchy. And let's say, it takes a year, Trump gets reelected, and we quench it, and we say, all right, these people, we expose BLM and groups like this for what they are. They're political groups with different goals than their stated goals. We will still have the residual effects of this precedent. We will still see a lot.
Elaborate on that. Elaborate on this precedent. Put a fine, because I think your point is really good here, but I want to make sure everyone understands exactly what you're saying.
Right. When we have, especially policy, so let's just break it down in policy, so something specific to the government. If we are going to start looking at policy now, and we have for a couple of years now, in what equality it brings in the end, what equity it brings. And a good, another amazing quote from How to Be an Anti-Racist is he talks about discrimination. Discrimination is not inherently bad as long as it brings more equity. So he has like an amazing quote in there to say like, man, I really want to find it now, and I actually might be able to pull it up real quick. The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination, right? So already putting good, bad discrimination, not inherently a pejorative term. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. That's a precedent being set. That is a precedent saying we need to learn how to discriminate, which I actually do believe discrimination is not always inherently a bad thing, right? I discriminate when I'm hiring. I make sure someone has, some sort of engineering background before I hire them.
Yep.
Like I'm not going to hire some kid with a poli-sci major, no offense, to fill out an engineering role. But this type of discrimination policy-wise, that we're picking and choosing winners, right? We used to really frown upon that, and now, I mean, we just started back in the '60s already. If we're going to look at every single policy just to make sure we build more equity, well, guess who else did that? The Soviet Union did that.
Totally.
And everyone who uses this as some sort of litmus test for their type of policy will always come to the same conclusion. The best way, especially we can put this in economic terms because it's the easiest one to see. The best way to make everyone equal in terms of economics is to make everyone poor. It's the only way you can do it. There'll always be winners and losers, inherently when people have a certain amount of skills who can be able to do something better, and they'll earn from it. But the only way we can make everyone the same is by making everyone equally poor. It's always the conclusion. But when you make everyone poor, it sounds bad, but they can rely on the government, and the government, will obviously treat everyone equally, as we see today.
Yep.
As we see, this discrimination mechanism that's in the government. Do you really rely on that changing once we meet equality? Or do you think we're just going to drop that mechanism?
Joe Biden
people are.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say.
I'll tell you in a second.
I would say completely, when someone runs on discrimination, when they say, I will eliminate discrimination, guess what they don't stop doing after that equality's met? They realize, hey, this is a winning talking point. Why am I going to drop it? So you need to manufacture inequality. That's normally what we see.
Oh, totally. That's the, gosh darn it. Eric Weinstein talks about this in terms of how that's the Don Quixote, manufacturing dragons out of windmills because you need it. That's the Southern Poverty Law Center kind of thing. That's that model of continual reproduction. I forgot what it's called. But the other part, so you were talking about using the government. So when I was saying Joe Biden, so I'm doing this thing right now where I call it kind of exploring the DERP gap, which is the difference in ideological reality perceptions gap. And so I'm only getting news and information from NBC, CNN, NPR, whatever. You can check it out on my locals if you want to look at it. But one of the things that I believe it was NBC wrote about how Biden wants to use the Fed to end racial inequalities when it comes to economics. And there's no real specifics there, but the point is that they want it to be part of the stated goal of the Fed to address and end and provide inputs into any area of racial economic disparities, which is exactly what you're talking about, where it's, you have to have action. That's the anti-racist versus racist. If you're not doing something, then you're actively contributing to the system. And so he wants to use the Fed, which I actually think we should completely get rid of the Fed entirely. It's really bad. I don't know if you've read The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is an amazing book. It's super long, but really, really good about the way that the Federal Reserve was created. So we should get rid of it entirely, but Joe Biden not him. There's no part of me that anytime I say Joe Biden wants to, that I'm actually referring to Joe Biden. I'm referring to whoever creates his policy and sends his tweets out. Because all Joe Biden wants to do is remember where the bathroom is, because he's tired of asking people throughout the day.
Well, real quick on Joe Biden, I'm beginning to realize Joe Biden is the perfect, and it's not an accident that he's a nominee for the Democrats. He's the
100% perfect. Absolutely perfect. No, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. Yeah, it's exactly right. So either way, but that's what you're saying is that there's people want to use the various levers of power to create these, going by the stated goals, right? Their stated goal is ending economic inequalities by race, but of course they won't be judged by the outcomes; they'll be judged by the stated goal. It's kind of like I forget, it might be Sol, maybe someone else, who talks about whenever a company does diversity and inclusion training, that they could say we did diversity and inclusion training, so the training is judged by its title. We did the training, not any outcome. Was there any outcome that's even remotely tied to any of this? Anyway, okay, so that sounds like a good transition point to some of these examples of corrupt hierarchies.
All right, there it is. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Make sure to join the Return to Reason Locals community and show Truman some support. You can go to returntoreason.locals.com to support his locals community, and you can also find him on ThinkSpot and YouTube by searching Return to Reason. And you can also find him on Twitter at MyMundaneMind. And as I said at the beginning of the show, I want to take a quick moment to share different ways you can help support this content. There are a few easy ways to do this. You can follow me on Twitter at ENG_politics. You can give me a follow on Parler at Engineering Politics. You can join the Facebook group named Engineering Politics, where I share and discuss content with the Facebook community. You can also subscribe to my video channel on YouTube under the channel name Engineering Politics, where you can find the video version of each podcast. I'm also active on ThinkSpot, which is a discourse-generating application that promotes intelligent and honest conversations while discouraging the trolling and nonsense found on most social media platforms. You can find all of my podcasts and videos on there as well. But the best way to interact with me, get the newest content, and support this podcast is the Engineering Politics Locals community. This is an amazing community that goes far beyond just a membership platform intermediary for creators. It allows followers of this content to get together and discuss the newest articles, podcasts, and videos all in one place. I strongly urge you to join the Engineering Politics Locals community at engineeringpolitics.locals.com. You can become a member for free, and now you can get a 3-month free trial when becoming a subscriber if you use promo code EPFREE. That's spelled EPFREE, no spaces. I would love to have your support with your subscription so this content can remain independent and keep growing. Monthly subscriptions to the Engineering Politics Locals community start as low as $2 per month. So I hope I can count on your support so I can start making higher quality podcasts and subscriber content like the bonus content at the end of most shows, and the new video series, the EP Zone, available only in the Engineering Politics Locals community with a subscription pass. I appreciate your consideration. Let's build a community together. Thanks for listening. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast. None of the persons, podcasts, books, or other references other than engineering politics used in this work directly reflect my ideas and/or personal beliefs, nor should they be held accountable for anything said during this podcast. Thank you for listening.